Hello, Thaís Sky here. Welcome to Reclaim the Podcast. I'm your host. So thrilled to be here for another episode of Reclaim. Today, we're going to talk about this question that sometimes comes up for us. Are these terrible thoughts that I'm having, right? These thoughts that feel really alarming to us. Are these terrible thoughts what is real? Let me set the scene here for you. We're having some anxious thoughts. We're having thoughts about, oh my God, I need to get my life in order. Oh my God, I need to go to the gym. I need to wake up more early. Like, what have I been doing with my life? My life is really bad. Like, I need more discipline. I need more willpower. I really need to get my stuff together. How could I have been slacking? How could I have been letting myself be so lazy? Let's say you're having some sort of variation of those thoughts, some variation of these kind of anxious, provoking thoughts. And then we wonder, maybe this is what's real. Maybe these thoughts are what is real. And any thoughts that we've had before are a way that we've been fooling ourselves into complacency. Maybe these terrible thoughts are what we should be actually listening to. Aren't we wanting to live in reality? Aren't we wanting to see the world as is? So why are we deluding ourselves and not believing these thoughts when it's clear that these thoughts are what's real? But are these thoughts real? What are these thoughts? How do we understand these thoughts so that maybe, I don't know, we can appreciate them or relate to them in a little bit of a different way? That's what this episode is going to be all about. Let's help you discern which thoughts matter. So let's get into it. So if you're new to the podcast, I'm Thaís Sky. I'm a licensed psychotherapist. I'm your host here on Reclaim, the podcast that brings nuance to popular psychology and offers help beyond self-help. You know, after a decade in the wellness world as a yoga teacher, I was a somatic coach. I became disillusioned with approaches that kept people on this kind of self-improvement treadmill without addressing the deeper patterns. I've always been interested in what's going on inside of us that drives us to do the very things that we don't want to do. That's what led me to go back to school to study clinical psychology and psychoanalytic psychotherapy. And I just have been so interested in what is required in order for us to experience real lasting change, because I believe that we have to go deeper than just behavioral fixes. So if you're a tender-hearted human craving substance, complexity, and a more honest look at the human experience, you're in the right place. I'm so thrilled that you are here. Thank you so much for listening. Before I get into the topic, I want to let you know that my year in review is coming. If you are not familiar, I release a 70-page workbook called Thaís Sky's Year in Review every year. This is the 9th iteration, which means we're almost at a decade of me releasing this workbook out into the world absolutely for free as an opportunity for you to spend some time reviewing the past year before setting your sights in the new year. I'm all about introspection, reflection, and creating mindfulness intention in our lives. And this workbook is my gift to the community for being here, for listening, as an opportunity for you to carve some time in this really crazy, hectic end of the year shenanigans to spend some time thinking about what transpired this year, what worked, what didn't work, so that you can set yourself up for success for the new year. So you can go check it out. Go to thaissky.com/YIR. You'll get on the wait list and you'll be notified the minute the workbook is released in the world. You can also go grab that in the show notes. Okay, so let's get into this topic of, are these thoughts real? It's a really common experience that we experience a kind of spike of fear, a realization, a thought emerges, right? That feels more real than anything that's come before. There's something so compelling about some of our thoughts. They arrive with an urgency and intensity and this kind of bodily signature, this sense of, oh my God, pay attention. And when we have that experience, it's very understandable that we start to wonder, are these thoughts actually do they warrant our attention? Do they warrant the urgency that they're coming packaged with? is this really something that we have been negligent of? And for those of us that are into self-improvement, that want to become better, these thoughts can often be wrapped up in the sense of like, you've been slacking. How have you not been paying attention to this? This is urgent. You really need to think about your life in this way. And that urgency can then make it actually hard to question. It can make it hard to slow down. And it can create more anxiety and more difficulties in discerning what's really going on. So I want to kind of think a little bit about what's going on there. So that maybe next time you have that experience, you can create a little bit more space, because anytime something comes to us urgently, we need to address this. This needs to be taken care of right away. There could be an opportunity to think a little bit more deeply about why it's feeling so urgent, because so rarely are things in life actually urgent. And when we take everything as emergencies, it actually becomes much harder to respond to actual emergencies. And so when we're having a real urgent moment where suddenly we realize everything about our lives need to be fixed, well, there may be something there for us to investigate that doesn't have to do as much with the content of the thought, and more so about the function that that thought is playing in your life in that moment. So I'm obviously doing this podcast episode because I see it often in my work as a psychotherapist. I have many patients who have expressed this, who have shared with me their frustrations around this type of thinking. And so to start off, this is quite common. If you're struggling with this, you're not the only one. But it can certainly feel very isolating. And I think it's because so often, it doesn't really feel like it's getting talked about in a way that creates space. I think a lot of the conversations around these types of thoughts are to kind of label it as obsessive thinking or rumination or intrusive thoughts, which we're going to break down those definitions in a bit too, because it's helpful. This is the way that our culture is identifying these thoughts. And sometimes it can be really helpful to identify and label certain things to release some of its power. And sometimes it doesn't resonate with us. It doesn't feel like it's an obsessive thought. It feels like it's a real thought. And so I want to kind of think about what's going on here in a little bit more of a spacious way than just like, let's just identify it and move on. But before I get into those definitions, let's talk about like this question of like, why is it urgent? Why does it feel so important sometimes to know if a thought is real? Because that's a lot of times what we're having this moment, we're having a thought, right? We're having a feeling, we're having a thought, and then we go with, and this is what's real. Why do we have to know if a thought is real? It often also comes with a sense of like, I want to live in reality, whatever that means. Sometimes we get this sense that to live in reality means to be healthy functioning, right? And we don't want to be in denial. We want to live in reality. As if denial is always a bad thing, as if living in reality is mired in like punitive thoughts, right? Like sometimes we're like, well, to live in reality is to know that I'm a piece of crap, right? Like that's what we're really saying in those moments, because these thoughts that come urgently tend to be very unkind about ourselves or about the world, right? Or about somebody else. It tends to come with this flavor of quite a cruelty. And so to think, oh, maybe I need to live in reality, this is what's real. Well, that's really interesting. Why is it that living in reality means living with a lot of shame or feeling really bad about oneself? Now, I think the reason why we so wish to kind of live in reality, I think there's kind of like an emotional wish hiding underneath this desire. One is the wish for certainty. If this is what's real, then there's a sense of like, this is what's certain. Now I know what to do, right? And we can think about why are these thoughts functioning in such a way that's pulling us into wishing that we knew for certain what was going on inside of us, right? There's also, of course, the wish to not be blindsided again. A lot of times we have these urgent thoughts because we feel like we need to move into action. We need to protect ourselves from the pain that we experienced in the past. And then there's also the wish to protect the self from vulnerability or disappointment, right? So if this is what's real and I can just embrace that I am a terrible person and that is what's real and I am lazy and I need to work on myself and I need to let myself off the hook, Well, what are we doing there? We're trying to protect ourselves. We're trying to create a buffer, that we're disguising it as living in reality, quote unquote. But really, it's a wish to move from whatever happened right before, we got these types of thoughts. And now we immediately move into, I know what's going on. I am a disappointment. And now I won't be blindsided again. Nobody can tell me I'm a disappointment because now I know. Now I know. And I've internalized this as the truth. This is what's true. It is really interesting when we start to think about like thoughts in general, because they are really, I think, what sets us apart in some ways of the human experience. I don't know. I imagine that there's a lot of philosophical and sociological and anthropological conversations about the meaning and derivatives of thoughts, and how come we think, and what is the seed of consciousness? And that goes a little bit beyond today's episode. But I thought it would be interesting to break down some of the definitions that are out there. Where did the concept of, like, for example, rumination come from? Because a lot of times that's what the flavor of these thoughts are. We start to have a sense of, oh my God, oh my God, right? I need to be having these thoughts. These thoughts are what's real. And then we ruminate, and then it kind of cycles in our minds. So I thought it was interesting that the word rumination comes from the Latin ruminare, meaning to chew the cud. And so before it was ever kind of described a mental process, it described how cows and other ruminant animals chew, swallow, regurgitate, and chew again. That physical act of recycling the same material over and over became the metaphor for the psychological process that often happens for us in these moments. So before the term rumination was really formalized in our culture, early psychiatrists and philosophers, they've been trying to describe this mental state for a long time. There's nothing new about this concept of like rumination, right? So they talked about it in terms of brooding or morbid preoccupation or fixed ideas or melancholic dwelling, right? Now, there was a point in time when these were seen as characterological or moral failings, not psychological processes. People who dwelt were viewed as weak or overly self-absorbed. I have to say that while we've tried to move away from defining this idea of rumination as a characterological flaw and more as an actual, just like a mental process, a lot of the patients that I work with that are afraid of their ruminating thoughts do see it as weak or as a sense of feeling overly self-absorbed. A lot of times we are deeply afraid of our ruminations. If there's something wrong with us, if we're ruminating, and it needs to be fixed right away, we need to stop it. We need to get over our stuff, and we need to move on. And so a lot of times there's a lot of judgment when we catch ourselves in this state of rumination. And one of the kind of key takeaways I want us to think about in this episode is that there's the thought processes or the mental processes or the psychic processes. There's things that happen in our mind, and then there's how we relate to them. And the Buddha called this the two arrows. There's the first arrow, which is the pain, and then there's the second arrow, which is the judgments about the pain. Yeah, so he called it the second arrow of suffering. It's this, like, again, this idea of like pain is optional, suffering, or pain is inevitable, suffering is optional. It's the sense that like there's the pain itself and all of our experiences of it, and then there's how we relate to it, how we judge it. And that judgment actually is what creates the suffering. It's us seeing our thought processes and labeling it as bad or wrong or weak, that then not only keeps the thought process continuing, because when we're judging it that way, we're trying to remove ourselves from it. We're trying to distance ourselves from it. We hope that the judgment and the self-attack will make it go away. But one, it doesn't. But what it does do is it keeps it kind of underground. It keeps it unconscious. It keeps it away from ourselves. And whatever we keep away, we're going to actually have a hard time dealing with. So we're not successfully addressing the pain. We're just driving the pain unconscious. And so if you find yourself in a state of rumination or in a state of obsessive thinking, in a state of having these anxious thoughts of what is real, the invitation is, can we notice these thoughts? Can we try to understand these thoughts? can we see it as serving a function and get curious about what that function is? And the idea is, if we do that, we're starting to make a little bit more space internally for us to stay in a thinking capacity rather than dropping into a lot of shame and internal collapse. So Freud never really used the word rumination, but the concept of rumination was definitely in psychoanalysis since the beginning. He described it as a kind of repetitive, cyclical thinking that attempts to ward off an intolerable affect. He thought of obsessional thinking was a defense, that the mind is trying to master trauma or conflict through repetitive ideation. So in some ways, for Freud, what we now consider rumination, he was starting to kind of think about it as a repetition compulsion, which is a psychoanalytic concept that is kind of really grown a lot and seen a lot of evolutions, and it's very relevant to this day, which is, again, it's like an obsessional defense, an attempt at mastery. If I repeat my trauma, this time I'll master it. It's a way of kind of like circling the wound, right, without really integrating it. Important kind of analytic ideas around this is obsessional neuroses, of the way in which thinking is an attempt to replace feeling, where we turn affect, we're turning feelings into thought in a way to avoid pain. And we then create these thoughts to tame unprocessed feelings. This, to me, feels really interesting because now we get to see that these thoughts, oh, this is what's real. This is what we need to be doing. The ruminating or the kind of obsessive cyclical thinking of like, I have to fix myself. I have to read the next book. The urgency of it tells us that all of this is a way that we're trying to move away from something else. Something happened, whether we were conscious of it or not, and immediately we try to protect ourselves from whatever feeling was associated with what happened by trying to move us into overcorrection, into perfectionism, into a defense against the pain. Now we're getting somewhere. If we start to see rumination as not an inherent problem, but a process of protection, now we can just start to think, well, when do you find yourself particularly ruminative or more obsessive thinking than other times? We can start to think about, when are you noticing yourself having these thoughts of, oh my God, this is what's real. How have I been so delusional? I need to know what is real. When are you having that? What is going on in your life or internally that you catalyze yourself into that mental process? There's information there for us. There's a real urgency in understanding what's going on in our mind and how we're thinking about certain things, because there's abundance, evidence, research that supports that rumination is intertwined with depression. Aaron Beck, who's the founder of cognitive theory, he looked and defined rumination, repetitive negative thinking, as a feature of depression. He didn't call it rumination, but he saw it as intertwined, right, with depression. He framed it, the words he used are like automatic negative thoughts, maladaptive cognitive patterns, or cognitive triad loops. He really kind of, I think, set the stage for us to think about the rumination with a heft, that there is something about it that is a feature of depression, that when it happens too much, when we're so busy ruminating, it's a way that we're actually really denying ourselves our pain. And when we deny ourselves our pain, that's what's causing a sense of depression. We're depressing our feelings through the ruminative thoughts. All right, I think that's enough on rumination. I think the reason why I really wanted to bring it up is, again, because how we label our internal experiences can sometimes help or it sometimes can harm, but at least it gives us something to work with. And when we understand that sometimes these types of thinking that gets us really caught up in a cycle, when we can label it as rumination, then maybe we can create a little bit more space to then understand, oh, why am I ruminating? What else is going on here? If we're seeing rumination, right, as like a sticky mind, something is getting stuck, and we really hope that we can figure it out by thinking about it. And that is like a flag that tells us actually maybe something else is going on. Something's not getting metabolized, right? Like there's a symbolic failure where the thought and the thinking stands in for an affect, a feeling that can't be metabolized, right? If we start to think about it that way, then it's like, all right, so let's slow it down a little bit here. Let's wonder, instead of getting caught up in whether the ruminating thoughts are real or not, can we see what else may be going on here for us? Yes. Beyond talks about it as a kind of a form of thinking without a thinker. Because if we are ruminating, we're not really actively thinking. Or if, I don't know, it's like, it feels like we're thinking, but it also in some ways feels like we're like, we're passively observing our mind being very, very active, but it doesn't feel like we're like the type of thinking that really requires some type of, gosh, what am I looking, like a type of skill or a type of active imagination. You'll find that ruminating or these kind of anxious thoughts of like, is this what's real? I need to live in reality, are not very imaginative. They're not very creative. And that's a sign that there's something else going on, that it's not really about whether it's real or not. It's about the fact that usually these thoughts are very rigid, very closed loop. They're very like insistent on something being figured out. Right? They're unproductive. Even if it is what's real, quote unquote, that you are a terrible person, what is the thinking going to help you do about it, right? So it is, I think, for many of us, a way to regain control when an internal experience feels really unmanageable, and it unfortunately often doesn't work. It's like a misattempt at self-soothing. It's an attempt to try to soothe something, but it really, really doesn't work. Now, a related label that I think warrants some conversation is the idea of intrusive thoughts. Now, intrusive thoughts are interesting because they've had, the earliest roots came out of a religious morality standpoint of having blasphemous thoughts, sinful ideas, impure impulses, right? Temptations, obsessions in like a spiritual sense. They were treated as like a moral failure or a sign of kind of spiritual corruption and evidence of demonic influence. At the time, there was no concept of an internal unconscious mind, right? That's Freud and beyond. Only this kind of moral will battling dangerous thoughts. And this moral framing shaped centuries of stigma around these thoughts. And a key feature of intrusive thoughts is that they are ego dystonic, which means we experience them as alien, unwanted, disturbing, like something is happening to us. Like we're driving down the street and we have the random thought of, what would happen if I just ran my car off the road, right? An intrusive, it just comes out of nowhere. And we're like, whoa, I don't want to actually die. Where did this thought come from? And so it's understandable that if we're in a kind of very religiously shaped culture, that we see that as something bad is happening inside, like a demonic experience, right? Like a failing of some kind. But now we understand it a little bit more deeply. It's not a failing. It is still very interesting why it's happening. Because, why do we randomly have a thought that is so far away from our understanding of ourselves? Why are they so involuntary? How can we have thoughts that are involuntary? Again, it really feeds a sense of like, how much control should we really feel like we have of ourselves and our minds, right? Now, of course, Freud was fascinated by intrusive thoughts, and he saw it as like unwanted thoughts that break into consciousness, often sexual, aggressive, or taboo, right? They're experienced as alien. Their attempts to, he formulated it as an attempts of the repressed material stuff we're pushing down to return. And we then defend against these thoughts by having counter thoughts or by having rituals or compulsions. We try to see these thoughts as really bad or try to kind of push them away. But Freud saw it more as a conflict rather than something that's really bad. With Freud's conceptualization of the tripartite model of the mind, with the id, the superego, and the ego, he believed that so much of the mind's capacity was to keep the id in line, the id representing our taboo, aggressive, naughty thoughts, and that the ego and the superego, the three kind of areas of the mind function together to try to help us operate in our world. And so having, let's say, an intrusive thought is part of the course of the mind. Something slipped out, something got out. And the invitation is not to see it as like a problem, but like, what is going on here? Why are we having a conflict? Maybe it's because there's something that's wanting to be known, something that's wanting to come out. Maybe there is a part of you that has fantasies about suicidality, and that's why you're just randomly thinking of driving a car off the road. Maybe there's, it doesn't even have to be that concrete. Maybe there's a part of you that wants to die, or maybe you're thinking about death and aging in a different way. I mean, there's so many things that we can think about there. But if we see an intrusive thought as a bad thing and something that we have to keep away from ourselves, we miss the opportunity to think about it as a conflict, to think about it as something is trying to come and be known. And if we take a more curious stance, then maybe this intrusive thought can be a gateway to know something more deeply about ourselves. It's important to know about intrusive thoughts is that, one, they're universal. Everyone has them. It's the way the mind works. We don't maybe necessarily know why, but it is how it works. And what matters more than the thought itself is the meaning that you attach to the thought and how you make sense of that thought. Pathology emerges, real problems emerge when you over-evaluate fear or try to control the thought. And by controlling the thought is like when we try to really exert a lot of power over our minds, when we try to have purity of thought and mind as a sign of our goodness, we make it so that whatever intrudes on that fantasy is going to be perceived as even more dangerous. What we're really kind of hopefully creating in our minds is actually safety to have all sorts of thoughts and to be curious about all sorts of thoughts without necessarily taking action on them, without believing them to be what is real, but rather to be able to play. Why is this thought coming up now? What could this be representing? Not all thoughts warrant a tremendous amount of attention, but if a thought comes to mind and it scares you, or if it comes with this like urgency and the sense of if you don't pay attention, you're really in denial. Well, maybe we could see that as, well, something is going to be denied if we ignored the thought. There's something in ourselves that's actually trying to make itself known. And that if we ignore it or we take the thought itself too seriously, we're actually continuing to deny the feelings and the experiences that are wanting to be known. So, the way I think about it is like that not all thoughts arise from the same kind of psychological level. Not all thoughts are created equal. Not all thoughts deserve the same amount of attention. Maybe we can think about it as like there's three main categories of thoughts. There's thoughts that are kind of signal anxiety. They are thoughts that are generated to explain a feeling that the psyche can't tolerate. We can think of thoughts as like old relational templates, right? Thoughts that are shaped by how we were once seen, spoken to, or evaluated. And then another category could be like genuine thinking, right? Thoughts that come from a place of curiosity, not panic. And if we think about it in these kind of categories, then we can, again, start to create a little bit of space of like, where is this thought coming from? And what function is it trying to play? Anxiety thoughts are often after the fact narratives, like I'm in danger, I made a mistake, or something bad's going to happen, are often like they're secondary elaborations that the mind creates to organize a kind of surge of affect. The thought is rarely the source. It's often the byproduct of a feeling. There's, science to support that, when information gets processed into our minds, it goes towards our feeling center before it goes into our prefrontal cortex. So we're having a feeling and an experience of what's happening before we actually have a kind of logical thought about what's happening. And so many of our thoughts are then actually deriving out of a feeling, not out of this kind of creative, impulsive, we're so brilliant and smart, and look at us thinking all these things. People who think that they are deeply logical are usually in denial about how many of their thoughts actually arise out of their feelings. And I know there's so many conversations about how do we juggle the rational mind and the feeling mind. Ideally, they work well together. The feelings get generated because of our past experiences, and then we get to think and make sense of try to understand what we're thinking. But oftentimes, so many of us try to use our logical mind to override our feelings, to deny our feelings, to say we shouldn't feel that way, or to try to make sense of the situation in a way that moves us away from our feelings. And then we start to create a real conflict internally because there really is no successful ways of denying our feelings. They just go repressed. They just go away temporarily, but they're there and they're going to come out in one way or another. And that's not supposed to be a bad thing. That's information. That's opportunity to know something of ourselves. So we can think about, if we want to differentiate the difference between like thoughts, which can be like automatic or intrusive or repetitive, and then thinking, which we can think about it as like a reflective capacity or a metabolizing or kind of symbolic, right? An active stance of getting curious about. Well, if we think about it that way, right, then anxiety in so many ways collapses thinking. It floods the mind with primitive thoughts that feel like facts. And that's the function it serves. And if we can think about it that way, then the invitation is how can we get the help we need to move back into a thinking ability? It's actually incredible how the ability to think is actually a developmental skill. The ability to think about ourselves without collapse, the ability to challenge ourselves without collapse. These are actually really hard skills that we can learn in therapy, that we can learn by creating more space internally for us to get curious about the types of experiences we're having. Now, what's tricky about this idea of like, oh my God, is this thought what's real, is that we often label the thought as maybe this is my intuition, this is my intuition telling me. And the thing about intuition is that whenever we're like, oh, is this my intuition? And the thoughts that we're having are extremely self-critical and judgmental and harsh and rigid. Why are we imagining that is how our intuition would speak to us? Right? Like, let's think about that for a minute. If we are connecting intuition with potentially a kind of spiritual component, we don't have to, but let's just say we do. And like a universe talking to you type thing, right? Or like something greater than oneself communicating to you. If we see intuition in that way, why are you imagining that this higher power would speak to you with so much cruelty? Maybe there's something there about how you were related to in the past, rather than it being an actual kind of experience of intuition, right? But again, we don't have to connect intuition with the kind of spiritual other, but regardless, the idea that trusting your gut means to believe that you're the worst thing in the world, or that you're so far behind, or that you're such a failure is really interesting. Why would we want to associate that with our intuition? Oftentimes intuition is actually quite quiet. It's not rigid. Anxiety is usually what's very loud. Intuition tends to hold a lot more complexity, whereas anxiety tends to flatten things as good and bad, and gives a sense of urgency that often just it's not commensurate to what's really happening. I used to really be very invested in this idea of trusting my gut and listening to my intuition, and I think it can get sometimes a little crazy making, trying to figure out which of my thoughts is my intuition. Because I think at the core of that desire to know, is this my intuition, is again the sense of, is this what is certain? It's the same type of, I think, desire around, is this thought what's real? We're just trading the word real for intuition. Either way, there's a desire that if it is your intuition or if it is real, it means you feel more certain about what's going to happen. We really like this omnipotent control. We really like the idea that our body or our mind, something outside us or inside of us, can for sure tell us what's going to happen. This is what's real. And that's, again, really, really tricky because the invitation is not to actually live in more certainty, because that isn't possible. Life is inherently uncertain. The invitation is, how can we tolerate uncertainty without collapsing? So if we want to kind of practice discernment, here are some questions that we can kind of ask ourselves. Does this thought of, I need to stop slacking off, I can't believe that I have been in denial about how bad I am or how bad the other person is, I need to get what's real, that they are a bad, right? If you're having that thought, we can ask ourselves, does that thought collapse us or expands us? By collapse, I mean, do we get defensive? Is it fear-based? Is it rooted in kind of this rigid something old and familiar and terrifying, right? Or does it expand? Is it curiosity-based? Does it feel like it kind of integrates our lives with our inner lives, our outer lives with our inner lives? Does it collapse? Does it expand? Does it create more new thoughts, or does it just lead into a kind of repetitive, ruminative process, right? Does the thought feel familiar? Because repetitive cyclical thoughts often originate from the past. So is it familiar? Is it something that you've heard before? Is it the voice of someone in your past? Is there familiarity to these thoughts? Is the thought accompanied by shame, panic, or self-loathing? These types of thoughts, this type of urgency almost is always anxiety talking. Something is getting kind of stirred up, and we're moving away from what got stirred up, and we're trying to make sense of something else. Yeah. And then the other kind of really important question is, can the thought withstand relational contact? If you can bring it to somebody, if you can bring it to therapy, if you can get a friend or to a partner without it disintegrating, it's probably closer to reality. If you share the thought and it really kind of disintegrates and you feel so much shame and self-loathing for having the thought and talking about the thought, and if someone questions thought, it feels like they're attacking you and it feels so bad, that's important information. Versus if you share the thought and somebody questions it or whatever, and it still stands, or you can play with it, or you can experience the relational contact with your thought, then that tells you something else about the thoughts that you're having. The reason why I think for so many of us, we try to trust the worst thoughts that we have about ourselves, like that's what's real. For so many of us, these terrible thoughts feel true because it matches early experiences of being blamed, shamed, or unprotected. Yeah, like it resonates how we were related to. Because believing the worst always feels safer than hoping for something better. To hope for something better, to believe something good about ourselves is a risk that can feel really terrifying for some of us. And like I said before, anxiety can often feel like a guardrail against disappointment and vulnerability. It's easier to believe the urgent bad thoughts than it is to believe the light, elusive good thoughts. It makes sense, right? That if our brain goes, I'm in danger, we're going to want to pay attention to those thoughts, because we're being chased by lions, right? Unfortunately, we're not being chased by lions anymore. We're like scared of a work deadline. Like, all right, there's something there, right? Our brain hasn't evolved, right, beyond its kind of more primitive way of understanding the world. It's just now being turned into like being afraid of a hard conversation with a friend, right? And so, our anxious thoughts can often mirror, it's like often like an echo of an internalized punitive voice from childhood. And we really want to explore that. And this is what we do a lot in something like a relational psychoanalytic therapy, is trying to understand what is that? Where did that come from? Why are you relating to your thoughts this way? You're probably relating to yourself this way because that's how you were related to. And so if we're like, okay, Thais, but like, but what does it mean to actually live in reality? Well, living in reality is not a frightening thought. It's not meant to be like reality is done bad. Reality isn't the harshest interpretation of ourselves. In psychoanalysis, reality really means being able to hold contradictions, being able to hold both the good and the bad, that you made a mistake, but you're a good person. That maybe you have not been going to the gym. It doesn't make you a terrible person. Maybe you've been tired, but maybe you want to set yourself up better, next month. It's like, living in reality means being able to distinguish the past from the present, which means we have to get very intimate in understanding where we've come from to know if that's what's really happening in the present. And living in reality really is about being able to stay in contact with emotions rather than bouncing off of it and moving out of it, trying to go into the ruminative thoughts, right? Being able to stay in like, what just happened? What am I feeling? What's happening here that's making me want to move away into the worst, harshest thoughts about myself? How then do we work with anxious thoughts without fighting them? Because again, fighting them kind of creates more conflict, right? And again, it kind of moves us away from the original pain. It's just like another layer of like moving further and further away. We have the pain, we have the kind of thoughts, and then we battle the thoughts, and it's like we're just step by step getting further and further away from maybe what's happening. So what can we do? Well, we can try to stay with the feeling, try to get curious about what could be coming up. We can try to talk about it with our therapist, we can try to journal it, try to bring some attention to like what's really going on. Trying to get curious about the origin of the feeling instead of getting shameful. I shouldn't feel this way, but you do feel this way. So let's think about why that could be. We could try to kind of let the thought speak without obeying it. So like, all right, so you're thinking about what it would be like to drive a car off the road. That's interesting, like, all right, so what? Can we just move about our day? Or if it is disturbing you, then see if you can bring it to somebody like your therapist to talk about what could be the deeper meanings that's happening there for you. And ultimately, I think the biggest takeaway from this is maybe instead of asking, is this thought true? Which again is like, what does that even mean? And why? The answer to that, it's a bad question, right? Because the answer to that question is what? If it's not true, then what? If it is true, then what? It doesn't lead us into anything really that generative. Instead, we can ask, where is this thought coming from? Where is this coming from? Why am I having this? Why am I worried about this right now? What's going on in my life right now that's leading me to be so concerned about this? Yes? So discernment of our thoughts is a developmental achievement, okay? It's not, it's something we have to actually work on to develop. And what we are doing when we're kind of relating to our thoughts a little bit differently is we're strengthening the capacity to think under emotional pressure, which is a really critical, important relational experience, to be able to think and talk under emotional stress and experiences. When we can think our thoughts rather than react to them, they actually lose their tyranny, they lose their power. And then we really start to feel a lot safer in ourselves. Not every thought deserves your obedience, deserves your attention, deserves your immediate action. Many of them actually just want to be understood, want to be thought of, want to be held in your mind. And when we can work on creating that capacity, the urgency starts to be a warning of a function of something rather than a truth that you have to respond to. Okay. So that is my episode on are these thoughts real? And if you're wanting more, the holidays can bring up so many tricky family dynamics. I recorded a whole podcast episode on navigating family during the holidays. How can we relate to our expectations, to disappointment, to grief and difference in order to foster a more easeful holiday season? You can check out that episode here, and I will catch you next time.